Well, thanks for such a lovely introduction, except for the shenanigans making fun of my accent. I should have seen that coming. I so richly deserve it. That's fine. I was giving Katie a hard time about the jokes. Now I know that I was making fun of her children. I feel terrible, but we shall we shall soldier on. So let's get started. So first of all, yes, indeed, I am. My name is Phil Hawksworth, and I am. Well, I was going to say I'm happy to be with you. I wish I were with you, but I'm happy to be joining you on the live stream. It's been great to be able to watch some of these fabulous talks and the panel and what have you. So I'm joining you from just outside London in the UK. So it's a little bit late at night here. So I'm hoping that my talk about web development won't be keeping my neighbours up through that wall there. But as Katie said, they've been hearing plenty of my singing in inverted commas over the last few days and weeks. I'm conscious that I've tried to be very fashionable and use this word old school, and I've spelt it with a K to try and be hip. I don't feel as an Englishman that I'm particularly well equipped to be doing that, so apologies in advance for that. But I do feel I was equipped pretty well as an Englishman to use the word boring. So I think one counteracts the other quite nicely. And so this idea of betting on boring is what I'm going to be getting into, talking a little bit about maybe building things for the web in ways that we might have discarded more recently because there are more fashionable things. I think there are real opportunities there. Boring is a word that you're very, you take your life in your hands, putting that in the title for a talk. Of course, you want excitement and you want interesting things at a conference and an event. So the fact that someone's going to come and talk about boring, and no, it's not the process of digging a hole. That's not what we're talking about. Sadly, it really is indeed boring, not interesting, tedious. That's my starting point. It seems like a crazy thing to be setting off with, but here we go. Before I do anything else, I should probably say I'm not trying to, by saying we should be doing boring things, I'm not saying that we should be doing the opposite of all the clever techniques and the kind of interesting insights that we've been hearing from other people at the event. There are smart people, there are invaluable insights coming through from this conference. So I'm by no means undermining those. But what I do want to think about for a tiny bit is what can we consider as our starting point for when we're building things, and what are kind of the table stakes, if you like, and some of the baselines that we could be building upon that could actually get us a lot further than we think. So by all means, all of the other techniques and the insights we're being hearing about, those are just as valuable as ever. I'm just thinking about a slightly different perspective as well. And we might want to think for a moment just a little bit about why do we build things for the web? Why we as practitioners build things for the web. I mean, certainly we can build things, experiences that kind of delight our users and hopefully entertain our users. Many of us might be building things for the web because we want to educate and perhaps inform. Certainly at times like now, we might be wanting to build things for the web that offer support or provide support to people. There are lots of wonderful reasons that we might want to build things for the web, and these all sound lovely and they're absolutely spot on as far as I'm concerned. But there's another thing to bear in mind as well, and that is that a lot of us are building things for the web because it's our job. We have a day job which involves building for the web, and those jobs can sometimes include some complexity and some other factors that might be a little bit different. If we have a job, we probably have bosses and we have clients, and that means that projects that we're building on might not be exactly as we'd set out them if we had complete freedom ourselves. I've kind of shown this in the past, and it feels really pertinent at the moment as well, thinking about how lovely it is to have the perfect project timeline that starts with the brief and ends in the awards, like any good web development project does, of course. Except as soon as we start putting anything between those two dots on the timeline, we realize that it's not really a perfect project timeline. It's just a project timeline, and things go south as soon as we think about how we need to start doing some work, of course, at some point. And before we can reap the rewards, the awards at the end, we need to launch something. And before we can start the work, we'll need to figure out what the scope of the project is. And before we can launch it, we'll probably need the client to give us some kind of final sign-off to say we built what we said we were going to build. Before they'll do that, they'll probably want to do some kind of a review of what we've built. And so already we're seeing that our beautiful, wide, long timeline is getting nibbled away at, and there's less time to do stuff than we might have hoped. But we start building things, getting things out into the world, perhaps sharing them with the client, starting to see progress as we build things. At which point, normally that's when we rescope, because we've started to actually make some headroom here and some headway here, and seeing what we're building, and starting to understand the problem space a little bit more. So often we rescope and start things again. So now pace is picking up. We're moving a bit faster now. We're building with a bit more urgency, getting to that all important client review so we can get that sign off. And after the review, there's feedback and there's changes that need to happen. So the pace quickens again and things get a bit more frantic, and we're starting to build a little bit more urgently, and maybe some of our processes are falling down, which is normally when something like this happens, where we're deploying things and we're not exactly sure what's going on. Something maybe has fallen away, but the next deploy we know will be absolutely on the money. We'll be back on track. Except this happens, it's like the wrong thing in the wrong place at the wrong time. It gets a bit frantic. So then, the pace quickens again to get that final sign off. And then we reach our final sign off, ready for launch. Except then we discover that final sign off was final sign off. It wasn't strictly final. So we've got a few more things to do before we launch. Then the launch day comes and we're ready to sit back and enjoy things after we do a few more bits of builds, some fixes go out, and then we're done. It's chaos from start to finish. We'd love to say it never is and all projects are smooth, but we know that often projects are a bit lively. So really what I'm saying here is that there's more than enough excitement to go around, particularly between these phases, these parts of the project that I'm talking about here. So I'm all for introducing some boring into this process. I'm all for introducing some things that are perhaps predictable. Always behaving or occurring in the expected way. That sounds like a lovely thing when we're building things for the web. So, I'm thinking a lot about that, and I'm looking at how we can introduce simplicity. But it's not only about making things, repeatable and predictable. There are reasons to simplify that impact performance and resilience. I'm noticing I'm getting comments. Are we okay? We're all good. Okay. So, yeah, there are lots of reasons that we might want to. I'm going to go back. Where are we? Here we are. Yeah, there's not only the reasons of simplicity and being able to be confident in what we're building that we might want to relook at, how exciting and how boring some of these things might be, but also for reasons of performance and resilience and reach. We'll get onto that in a little while. I think it's fair to say that we've come a long way since the first web page was published. I know we're playing kind of buzzword bingo. Feels like this site should be on there as well. I don't know if it's come up already. I haven't seen it along the way, but no conference like this surely would be complete without it. But we've come a long way since that site came online. The experiences we make now are very, very different. We've got much more sophistication in the kinds of things that we're building in terms of the experiences that we're building, the users, their expectations and their anticipation and their abilities, much more sophisticated now than when we started. And likewise for things like the tools that we're building with and bringing to bear on our web development projects. I think it's fair to say that as developers, we love to invent. We love inventing things. That's what we've been doing all along since we started building the web and building for the web. We love to invent. We love to iterate on the processes and the tools that we're using, improve things, and reinvent things as well. And that's something I want to get onto as soon as I let this cat out of this door. Here you go. Here you go. Never ever had to do that during a conference talk in the past. It's a new one on me. So we like to reinvent things. It's something that developers do for sure. And that's fair because new challenges are coming up all the time and often they warrant new solutions. But I'd urge you a little bit of caution here. I love this quote from Eric Severy, who said, the chief cause of problems is solutions. I like having quotes like this from people who have wise things to say. Although he also said dealing with network executives is like being nibbled to death by ducks. Okay, I don't know how to really apply that one. Although nibbled to death by ducks does feel very kind of reminiscent of this stage of the project, where lots of things are happening in lots of different areas, and so I can kind of convey that a tiny bit, I guess. But when you're talking about the chief cause of problems being solutions, it's a bit tongue-in-cheek, of course, but I think it's fair to say that we as developers in the web development community, we love inventing new hammers. We might find that we've got a solution that's perfectly viable for an existing problem, but we love finding a new and creative way to solve that problem. And hammers keep changing all the time, and I kind of wonder, are they better hammers that we're creating? Well, I think yes. Some of them are, but not all of them, and therein lies the rub. Which ones are the better tools? Which are the improvements? Which ones should we use? And I'm going to invoke a term here that I'm cautious of using, but I think it's a really important term to have in your back pocket when you're thinking about these things. It depends. We say it all the time, and it feels like a ridiculous kind of throwaway comment, something to wriggle out of giving a proper answer. But I actually think that saying it depends is hugely important. I think it's a precursor to lots of important questions. And if we're going to choose the right tools wisely, we must ask questions. We have to ask questions of what we're building, why, what it needs to do. And in fact, again, if we go back to our diagram of doom over here, we ask questions in this timeline. The scoping exercise is exactly that. It's the opportunity to ask questions and gather requirements to do with what the functionality is going to be, the functional and non-functional requirements of a project. Getting these things gathered is critical, and it helps us avoid, frankly, just defaulting to the same tools that we're just enjoying using, because not every project, of course, is the same. So I want to just give a very, very brief, very light example of something that surprised me that's kind of pertinent to this. And that is the reason it's relevant is just the perception I encountered of what tools I might have used to build this little thing. So this is a little while ago now. Many of you may recall that there's a bit of a stampede to liberate some content from Medium a while ago. Lots of people were grabbing content and wanting to rehome it. And I thought it would be useful to build something that would do just that, would make it very simple for someone to say, this is the URL of where my content lives, this is my feed, grab that for me and create me a site which has an index page and then a page for every one of those articles. It's a very, very simple project, but I built this quite quickly, released the code into the wild, and kind of thought not too much more of it. But then I started getting feedback and questions, and a lot of the questions were to do with the performance of it. People were saying, wow, it performs really quick, it's really fast, it renders really quickly. How did you do that? And I kind of responded on Twitter saying, a few people have asked me what I did to make this so fast. The answer is nothing. I just didn't add anything to make it slow. And I'm conscious that sounds a tiny bit flippant, but really that's exactly the case. If we kind of think about what this thing is, there's not a lot going on really. I mean, I got the data, I made that data into HTML, I put it somewhere that people would be able to access it, and then when they asked for it, I gave it to the user. That's kind of web pages 101 in many ways. But if we kind of look a tiny bit at this at a slightly different angle, maybe through a slightly different lens, what's happening is making an API request, and then with the data that comes back from that request, we're rendering out some HTML, and then that gets deployed to somewhere that people can then access it later on, some kind of hosting environment. And then it's a traditional request response that delivers that. And so, when you start to look at it this way, again, it's the building blocks of the web, but it's starting to introduce one or two terms that people latch onto. And this is one in particular that kind of surprised me. Someone who I won't name to protect the innocent said, "How are you rendering so fast?" And that caused me to kind of think a little bit. That kind of caused me pause. Like, rendering, we talking about when we're saying rendering? And yes, I know that I used the word rendering here in this diagram, but it's not so long ago that I think I was made fun of after a conference a few years ago where I talked about rendering something on the server, and I was pulled up and someone said to me, do you mean a server that returns HTML like web servers do? And I said, yes. But rendering has become a term that we use more often now because it's become a slightly more complex landscape. So I wanted to just talk for a moment or two about rendering and talk about the different types of rendering that exist. And I think there are three kind of particularly kind of prime examples of popular rendering. There's client-side rendering. So in other words, JavaScript in the browser manipulating the DOM to generate the view. There's server-side rendering at request time, which is what web servers has done for a very, very long time. So in other words, generating the markup on request at the server and then transmitting it to the client when it's been requested. And the other one that I tend to think about is, again, server-side rendering, but this is at build time. And that's generating the markup at build time so that it's ready to transmit when the client then comes later to request it. I often used to talk about server-side rendering at build time as pre-generation or pre-building or pre-rendering. I just find that those terms seem to introduce lots of confusion, and people talk about server-side rendering, but they're often conflating request time and build time. And I think there's a really important distinction there. What I was doing in this kind of noddy little example was I was doing server-side rendering at build time. It was built early. And it was doing what Aaron Swartz kind of popularized when he used the term bake, don't fry. It's baked in advance rather than fried up on demand. And so that seemed to make a lot of sense to me, and it seemed like the obvious thing to do, but I was kind of surprised that people were asking, how have you done this? I think this is a really good example as well of a process which is nowadays very repeatable. This kind of column here, this kind of hollowed box column, all of these processes are very, very repeatable and automatable. There's nothing exciting or exotic going on with those, but they're very easy to repeat. I think a little bit about the model of whether things need to be read very often or written very often, how often they update, and how often you need to update a view of something. This kind of thing doesn't need to be updated and refreshed every time any user comes to it. This is the kind of thing that might need to be updated once a day, twice a day, perhaps once an hour at a push. I suspect not, certainly not for things that I was publishing. So it's a perfect candidate for this kind of repeatable process. The thing that shocked me really is why anyone would ask, how did you make it fast? Why would this ever be slow? I mean, look at the site, look at what's on there. It's the kind of thing that ought to be lightning fast. So I think it's a real sign of the times that people are asking, how did you render this so quickly? The answer is I did the boring thing. I just turned it into HTML and served it as a bunch of static assets, nice and simple. So modern tools support various different types of rendering, and I'm not bashing those at all. I think they're incredibly valuable and incredibly important. And the question is, which is the best one? And the answer, of course, is it depends. I'm very keen on assessing or like reviewing the requirements before choosing the tooling. And it's often a hard habit to break. If we consider these two sites, Katie mentioned at the beginning that I work at Netlify, and I'm going to shamelessly use the example of two Netlify websites to illustrate this point. The one on the left is our www site. It's our homepage, it's our blog, it's our pricing page, it's our documentation, it's all of that stuff. It's the website. The thing on the right is our web app. It's app.netlify.com, and that is the application, the product that people interact with. And they have very different profiles, and so they have very different tools. So the one on the left, is updated regularly, but not constantly. It's read very, very often, as certainly in contrast to how often it's written and updated. I think of it as a viewing site rather than a doing site. And so it's a good candidate for being rendered at build time and not at request time. So it's a static site generator that builds this and then deploys it as a bunch of static assets for us to very boringly and efficiently deliver. The one on the right is different. It's updated constantly because it's personalized, individualized content that's there. It's read and written very, very often. And so it's delivered as an app shell, because this is a doing site rather than a viewing site. So I think Taylor mentioned earlier on about rendering statically an app shell and then using client-side rendering to enhance that with progressive enhancement. And that's what happens here. This is a site that's served as some static assets of HTML and JavaScript. That's JavaScript as React. And then in the client side, it's doing client-side rendering to then pull in APIs and enhance things that way. Two very, very different things and two very, very different tools. So I think it's important when we're choosing how we're going to build things that we need to choose wisely. The tools that we might use for one project aren't the tools that we'd necessarily use for the other. But I'm always keen on being as boring as possible and as mundane as possible to take out the risk as much as possible. Because infrastructure, for instance, can be complex. Right? If we think about how we serve things on the web, you know, we've got a browser that makes a request to some infrastructure. Perhaps it hits a load balancer that then hits one of our web servers, which then, you know, needs to get some data from somewhere, maybe a database server, to return that to the web server for it to be mashed up with a template to create a view that we pass back through, comes through the load balancer, and finally into the eyes and the browsers of our user. There's a lot of moving parts and lots of lines and boxes there. When we think about our deployments and how we update things on the web, that means that, you know, whenever we make changes, we might need to be changing configuration here at the load balancer, code and logic and content, maybe in the web server, more content in the database servers, I should say. There's lots of places we need to make changes whenever we make changes. And this, of course, isn't just in production. This is in production and staging and testing and development, all of these environments that kind of should be the same. So there's a lot of complexity. Ideally, you know, in production, we'd probably, you know, take some of the things that can be served statically and move those out to a CDN, and then some of the requests are going to a CDN instead of to our infrastructure. It's a very common pattern, particularly in the enterprise. And that, of course, then means that we've got to be deploying things there. Sometimes that's deployed from the web server. It gets complicated. It gets very, very exciting. And that's what I want to avoid. I want to avoid that excitement in the infrastructure, because, of course, you know, back to our diagram again, every time we make changes here, at every one of these terrifying points on this diagram, we're talking about making changes to all of those bits of infrastructure and keeping those the same. So my challenge is, can we do this stuff at build time? Can we bake and not fry? Can we move this kind of exciting infrastructure something closer to this, where everything is pre-rendered and pre-generated, server-side rendered at build time, if you like. So it's everything can be at the CDN. That gets us to this lovely kind of boring scenario of asking for stuff and getting stuff and everything else kind of going away. Not interesting, tedious, great. I love that. Because apart from anything else, it has implications, not just on the development workflow and our confidence, but also on things like performance. You know, if we're able to get to the point that we don't have all of that infrastructure and everything is being served quite boringly from just the CDN, that's a huge advantage over what we might do in more exciting stacks. The more exciting stacks might, you know, for the sake of performance, add static layers to improve performance. And what I'm talking about there, of course, is caching. You know, we've seen this ourselves and many of us when we're building projects that get complex. Where do we add caching? Well, you know, in the web servers, we'll add layers of caching. We'll cache common queries in databases, even through the load balancer. And of course, the CDN itself is just a big cache. The fact that not all of these things are cached and just some of the aspects are cached and some of the things are happening dynamically introduces some complexities there. And that's why, you know, managing this kind of infrastructure is big business. What if instead of that, we could just serve everything from the CDN? Just say there is no logic that needs to happen that we need to manage. It just simply happens at build time and we push everything there. It's not as exciting, but the results are quite different and the performance profile is way different. Likewise for scale, you know, exciting stacks add infrastructure in order to scale. The fact that we've got caching introduced, of course, helps massively. But if we start to think about how do we scale, and in other words, how do we handle increased loads, lots and lots of requests, the traditional way to do it is we'll add infrastructure, we'll add more servers, we'll plan for more servers and cost more servers and get those in there throughout our infrastructure. And And that, of course, is something that needs to be maintained throughout the project. And we need to be able to deploy our code to all of these things and manage it. Far from boring, alarmingly exciting, I would argue. Why does this matter? Well, I really think it's particularly pertinent at the moment. And I thought twice about putting this next slide up, but I thought it couldn't really be ignored. This is a post from Eric Meyer a couple of days ago, a week or so ago rather. And he was talking about static as well. And he was talking about how at this time, when there's lots of sites that are serving critical information for people who sorely need it, lots of infrastructure is failing. Lots of architecture is not standing up under the load. And I'll just call out this one thing that he said, which is too many sites are already crashing because of their CMSs can't keep up with the traffic surges. And too many sites are using dynamic frameworks that drain mobile batteries and shut out people with older browsers. That's annoying and counterproductive in the best of times, but right now it's unacceptable. As I say, I thought twice about putting this up because I didn't want to just be too emotive, but I can't think of a better example of demonstrating why building things with the best possible principles and built to scale in ways that are less exciting and exotic is really important and has huge dividends, and is particularly important. But you might say static sites, static assets, deploying things directly to a CDN, not having a dynamic web server behind the scenes, that gives boring experiences. And actually, no, there's lots of techniques to work around that. And that's because the whole landscape is maturing. Marcus Schork, who's a CTO at a part of Unilever, kind of coined this term of static first, which I kind of like because it kind of puts me in mind of progressive enhancement. Just thinking about this from an infrastructure point of view. And there are examples where you can start to think about how you can embellish static hosting environments with serverless. Serverless functions can come to the rescue, kind of as an enhancement. So in the little time I have left, I'm going to rush through a rapid example. Let's see how quickly we can get through this. I might be a couple of minutes over. So this is a silly example, but it's just to demonstrate that without adding lots of exotic infrastructure, or indeed exotic code or frameworks in the front end, we can do something that feels a little bit more dynamic. Certainly it's a little bit more playful than the territory we were in a moment ago. But we can also start to capture things like user-generated content, all without that kind of complex infrastructure. So this is a little site I made, a bit more playful than the last one, called vlolly. The idea is that you can click a button and fill in a form where you can choose the colors, flavors of your lollipop, and send a message, which is just a form, and posting that message will create a new entry, if you like, on a URL that you can send to a friend and give them a smile. It's a silly example, but it demonstrates a few things. And what would I use to build that out? Well, it depends. What are my requirements? Requirements I gave myself were wanting pre-generated pages with real URLs. I'm a URL nerd. I think URLs are important. Even for the user-generated content here, I wanted real URLs for that. Data stored in a database, because but I don't want to become a DBA. And then also instant access to the new content. We talk about rebuilding sites and building things ahead of time and putting them onto some hosting infrastructure, but I want instant access to that new content. I didn't want to wait for a rebuild. So the tools I used for this example were, I used Eleventy, which is a static site generator. We could have used anything for this example, any static site generator. I used FaunaDB as the database, because that's a database as a service with an API that I could use. And for the instant access to new content, I use Netlify functions because I'm familiar with it. Any serverless function provider would have been able to do just the same thing. So I'm going to show you a diagram. Diagram, we'll dig into it really quickly in my minute or so. I waffled at the beginning, so I'm going to go over by a couple of minutes. So the view that we see of any lollipop is something that's pre-rendered ahead of time. It's a static asset. We just see that on the URL. But what about how do we populate that? So we populate that with some code that we run at build time. I'm not going to make you read this, but suffice to say that we authenticate with the database where all of our lollipops is held. We query for all the lolly datas, and that returns a promise for that query. We resolve the promise of lollies, and then we catch any errors. And this generates a data object that we can then use our static site generator to give us a page for all of those lollies. I also just wanted to be able to have a slide that says resolve the promise of lollies. It's a wonderful thing. What about how we create these things? Well, this is another static view. It's a page with a form on it. And that form, where does it post? It posts to a serverless function because we have no servers, but we can post directly to a serverless function, which saves the data, pushes it to the database, and then sends us to the view of that lolly. Sadly, though, we're waiting for a site to rebuild. So when we make a request to that new URL, that'll 404. But that's fine, we can handle that. And there's a couple of things that come to our rescue. Triggers and automation. I talked earlier on about generating content and being able to automate that kind of flow. We can do that here as well. And also we can trigger builds. Lots of infrastructure and lots of services now allow us to run build based on an incoming trigger, like a webhook. This is what that looks like in this service. You know, I have a webhook, which is just a URL that says there's a new freezer in the lolly, a new lolly in the freezer, rebuild the site, please. And what happens then is that's fired at this point with when I call the save data function. Again, not going to make you read this. We authenticate with the database. We post the data. Once we posted it, we call our function, call our API to rebuild, our webhook to rebuild, and then we send the user to go and check for the new page. And if when we check for a new page, if there is a page there that's been rendered already, then we return that with a 200 static file. Great, we're done. If it's not there, we're serving a 404, but we can do something clever with that 404. That 404 can actually be served from a serverless function. So we can render a dynamic view kind of as an enhancement. Because although the page doesn't exist here in our pre-rendered pages, it does exist, the data does exist in the database. So this serverless function over here can go off and get that data and return it. So this is what the code looks like for that. You know, we pull in our page template as a JavaScript literal. We authenticate with the database. We get the lolly data. We serve the lolly as a response, an HTML response. And if there really is nothing there, then we break the bad news. And this is my proudest moment in this project, creating a 404 page that looks like this. This is my crowning glory, having a lollipop stick and nothing there. There's some enablers that make this thing happen. So it's custom 404 routing that you can send to serverless functions. This is becoming more widely available now. It's really, really powerful. Events and triggers and automation can really unlock all kinds of really interesting possibilities without having to add lots of other complexity. I know what I've shown looks a little complex there, but I've actually illustrated quite a few things all at once. Functions as a service really unlocks all kinds of possibilities as an enhancement. You know, this is the kind of thing that enables us to go further than we might have gone before with creating static assets and putting them on a file server or a CDN. This example, you know, had no frameworks, had no client-side rendering. There are no web servers. It's kind of boring, but I like what that gives me. I like the possibilities that gives us. I have to say I love JavaScript. You know, I'm a huge JavaScript fan. I think of it a little bit like salt. It can really make or break a dish, but you just need to be careful not to over season. I think it's important that we kind of find the best recipes, find the best way that we can deliver the kind of things that we want as an experience, and find the baseline for it, considering what seasoning we need, and then we can serve it in kind of cool ways and then enjoy that. Some of these tools might be boring, but that's perfect for me. I'm sold on that. I'm sorry I had to rush through the last end of that. I'm a little bit over time, I apologize, but I'm done. Thanks ever so much for listening and for having me. Very happy to answer questions and follow up. My Twitter is there on the screen, @Hawksworth, and also post my slides a bit later on. Thanks ever so much for listening.